So I want to give you some additional content, uncensored, about mid-century style, to give you some additional context to place our discussion of campus style within it, and also as a way of kind of bridging us. We talked a little bit about World War II and fashion with our discussion of the zoot suiters, but I want to kind of bridge us from that World War II moment and our discussions of the 20s and 30s into the post-war period, and how fashion for women, which is going to be my focus, shifts and changes. And I think this will also be really helpful in informing our conversations next week when we look at queer style in Carol and a Single Man. So this will set the scene in lots of ways. So I'm going to frame my discussion with two figures, two designers, who I think get us to some really interesting ideas in thinking about mid-century style. And those two designers are Clare McCardell, whose work you see on the left, and Christian Dior, whose work you see on the right-hand side. So I'm going to start with McCardell, but in doing so, I want to start with World War II as it plays out for American women in their fashion. So here I'm showing you some pages from Life magazine from April of 1942. And you can see a story called "Men Lose Their Pants to Slack Crazy Women." So the press seems never to be shy in the early 20th century through mid-century, commenting on these crazy ladies wearing slacks. And I think it really gives you a sense, you can go all the way back in your mind to our discussions of the bloomers. And, that is happening in the 1850s, nearly 100 years later. Women donning trousers, still a point of discussion. Although certainly many more women were wearing trousers in the war years than had worn bloomers. And you can see women participating in war work here, all different kinds of activities that were crucial in the war years and supporting the war effort. Here you've got some examples of uniforms. These were designed for women who were working at Boeing, the airplane manufacturer, by a designer named Muriel King, who was a very well-known designer in the period. She'd started out as a costume designer, and she was hired by Boeing to create uniforms that would be safe and practical for the women in their factory. But also she was tapped because she recognized that women wanted something that was stylish and that was also, really importantly, very easy to care for in terms of what they would be asked to wear. These uniforms were originally made not as a requirement, but just as an option for the women at Boeing, and they were so popular that they essentially sold out of the first run of manufacturing. So they were quite successful. They included overalls, bandanas, aprons, pants, and blouses. There were also some office workers' uniforms that included skirts. But key to these were that there were no cuffs and no flat pockets, nothing to get caught in the machinery they were working with, and fuller cuts to allow for freedom of movement, which I think you can see pretty well with the woman who is second from the right-hand side there, with her legs spread apart there and her hands on her hips. It's a really great photograph. There was no need for belts in these garments, and that was an important safety measure. They were meant to be dust-proof and lint-resistant. The turban that you see worn by the woman on the right-hand side, which would have been out of a bright color, was described in the article as a warning antenna, so that you could spot people across the factory and see them coming. You can see here on the left-hand side, a group of women in the Boeing factory wearing some of these designs, and you can see they are all wearing turbans, both to protect their hair, but also, again, to serve as an easy way to see people walking through the factory. You can see the size of this plane that they're working on. It's going to be important as you're moving around these large impediments to make sure that you see everybody. So this was an example of a fashion designer, and you can see one of her looks, including trousers, pantaloons, from 1937 here in this image, adapting style to the needs of war workers in this period. And there were, of course, high-end, more designer options for wealthier women consumers in this period in terms of adopting trousers and having that as part of their wartime looks here. Also, of course, fabric rationing is going on at this time, when we talked about that with the zoot suitor. So that becomes an important part of defining the styles and looks that were available to women in the period. So here I've got an example on the left-hand side of one of Clare McCardell's looks, this one from 1945. And the caption in this ad reads, "The simpler, the smarter." Smarter meaning fashionable. That was a way of talking about being fashionable. I love that you look smart, that you look well put together. And so I think that is a great descriptor for McCardell's style. It really placed a premium on simplicity, on utilitarianism, but also on style. And I just also couldn't resist showing you this great image of an actress, Celeste Holm, in a play called The Bloomer Girls. These are not by Clare McCardell. I wish they were. But these are a kind of like take on the Bloomers from 1945. A set of verbena green pajamas, and the pants are described as having a Chinese cut. I'm not sure what that means, but as I've told you all before, I have seen a lot of images of women in trousers in which, Chinese pajamas, different non-Western places are cited as the origin. You could think about the bloomers, the Turkish trousers, right, that are the origin of the bloomers. So, that's always a part of this. But this is a design by Claire Potter. But I think, again, it gives you a sense of the kinds of simple designs that women were wearing in the years of World War II. So here's a design that Clare McCardell adds to that conversation to much acclaim. It's called the Popover Dress. McCardell is one of an unusual group of fashion designers that actually gains patent protection for some of her garments. And this in part came out of being burned early on when she made a design. I think it was for her monastic dress. It was a very simple dress that was a kind of rather shapeless shift that could then be tied and cinched at the waist by the wearer. And it was so popular that it was copied all over the place, and it nearly bankrupted Townley Frocks, who she was working for at the time. So she ended up, because she was a designer who would use a similar cut and style over and over again, wasn't changing these things every year, necessarily changing fabrics, changing length and things like that, but basic shapes often stay the same for her. She decided to patent some of her garments. And so this was one that she patented. It was designed in 1942. The story goes that she was asked to make this design by Harper's Bazaar magazine. They asked for a dress for women whose domestic help had left to go work at the factory during the war, and so women who were newly working in the kitchen. So I think probably the women who wore this dress were women beyond those who had relied on domestic help before the war, certainly, but it was at first imagined to be a sort of elite audience that would be wearing this dress. So what McCardell designs, in line with the rationing restrictions of the period, is based on these wrap apron dresses called Hooverettes, and I'm showing you an example of them from the 1930s. This was a design that was named after Herbert Hoover. Seems weird, right? He was the Secretary of Agriculture at the time that patterns for these dresses started to become popular, so well before the 1930s. And they were very practical styles for women who were working in the home because you could get like one half of the dress dirty and then you could just wrap it the opposite way and keep wearing it. So if you were cooking in the kitchen, if you were working on a farm and you were, outside with the chickens or whatever, and then you're coming back into the kitchen. So very, very practical garments. And so that was the inspiration for McCardell's wrap dress. So all this to say, no Diane von Furstenberg didn't invent the wrap dress. No Elsa Schiaparelli didn't invent the wrap dress. And no Clare McCardell didn't invent the wrap dress. The wrap dress, I think, is a concept that has been around for a good long time, and we can't really credit anybody with it. But what McCardell did was to make it fashion, as the kids say today. So McCardell's included this big patch pocket and an attached pot holder, very convenient for your cooking in the kitchen. And she also, here you're seeing a version in blue linen. She also produced it in denim. She was a great believer in really practical fabrics. She loved using calicos, denims, gingham, madras checks, flannels, things that were comfortable and were hard wearing and could be easily cleaned. She explained, quote, "Clothes ought to be useful and comfortable. I've always wondered why women's clothes had to be delicate, why they couldn't be practical and sturdy as well as feminine," end quote. So that was really her design ethos. And this dress had a pretty low price point when it came out during the war. It was $6.95 and was classified as a utility garment. So that meant that it could sort of get around some of the rationing rules, which was important. And from this point on, some form of wrap dress would have been included in almost all of McCardell's collections. They were usually a bit more expensive than this one at that point, $25 or $30. So for that more exclusive clientele. Another thing to notice on this dress too is her use of top stitching. So as that kind of form of decoration, but also as reference to more kind of workaday clothing like denim, for instance, which at this point in the 1940s would have generally been worn as workwear, not yet as fashion. And so this was a dress that demonstrated the possibility of chicness and practicality all at the same time. A lot of McCardell's styles from the 1940s emphasize this simplicity. She loved to play with exposing fastenings, as in this beautiful brown dress with pink hooks and eyes, which just pop off. So fastening and utilitarian elements become the decoration on the garment. So rather than like applying some other form of decoration, it's about exposing the fastenings. She also liked things that were easy for women to put on and take off themselves, so that helped women to be sort of self-sustaining. Here are some examples of a popover dress continuing on in McCardell's collections well after the war years, this beautiful striped one from 1955. And just notice, especially those of y'all who are makers, the gorgeous, gorgeous way that she uses the stripe within the draping of this dress. It's just really stunning. And again, you can see the closures on the side, that interesting design element there. The day dress that you're looking at on the right-hand side from 1952 shows McCardell's penchant for garments that were really easily adaptable for women. So this is a dress that is just being cinched in by that belt. And so it can be worn by a woman at sort of varying levels of tightness or looseness according to her mood and her needs. And so she really believed in clothing that was adaptable. She also, by the way, helped to popularize tights, leggings, leotards, way back in the 1940s. So here you can see some examples of that. You can see the woman in the top left putting on this kind of wrapped tunic, and I believe that's the same garment as you see there on the cover. So again, very practical. She loved pockets, often had pockets in her garments. So one of the things she learned during the war years was that some of these dance clothes were less rationed than other kinds of clothes. So that's part of why she was making use of some of those. She really is one of the pioneers of sportswear, designer sportswear in the US, and making kind of higher end sportswear. And here you can see some more examples from 1944, her version of the Bloomers costume on the left. So just to give you a sense of cost, this was a $35 ensemble on the left here, which in today's money would be about $484. I would say one thing to keep in mind is that people bought a lot less clothing then than they do now, certainly. So this was a higher end garment, but not as wildly higher end as that price point suggests. So probably like upper middle class level, not like, you know, super rich elite level, maybe some middle class women too. So just to give you a sense of kind of where she's falling in terms of price point. Also, by the way, women could have bought her patterns to make their own versions. So that's also part of how her clothing sort of is distributed. And also, if you find yourself wearing ballet flats, you can actually thank, one person you can thank is Clare McCardell, who again recognized that flats, ballet shoes were not being rationed, and the materials to make them were not being rationed in the same way as other materials to make shoes. So she worked with Capezio and designed ballet flats to go with her collection, like these ones in the top left that you can see. Here's another example of a fantastically adaptable garment that the great Georgia O'Keeffe actually owned. So here you can see the penchant that McCardell had for top stitching. And you're seeing that on this, what I think probably was a dark blue, but now looks a bit gray because O'Keeffe wore it a lot. So this was a cotton dress she had later remade in silk, actually, because she liked it so much. And you can see that it's, again, that sort of belted style so that it could be adapted by the wearer in whatever way she saw fit. And you see McCardell there in the center in a very similar style of dress. And you can also see a similar style in the pages of Vogue magazine on the far left, in Harper's Bazaar. And again, you can see the pockets that this one has. Really great. And I love how O'Keeffe has accessorized it with this pin at the throat and a concho belt. Okay. So from McCardell then to Christian Dior. So Dior's so-called New Look collection, which was launched, in 1947, is one of those fashion collections that has become rather iconic. This was his very first show, just 2 years after the end of World War II. And the fashion industry in Paris was really in quite a shambles. McCardell was kind of around at this moment that just, you know, by the whims of history meant that the market was a little bit clearer for American designers in the US because they weren't competing with French designers. So as the French market for fashion begins to build itself back up, Dior is just beginning his career. And he has his first show on February 12th of 1947. And it's Carmel Snow, who was the editor of Harper's Bazaar at the time, along with the American press, that dubbed it the New Look. So what's so new about the New Look, you may be asking yourself, or maybe not. So we talked a little bit about sort of the role that women played in the war. You maybe have this sort of popular image of Rosie the Riveter, right? We looked at those women working in the Boeing factory. So this moment in the post-war period is very much one, and you can see it exemplified by these two magazine covers, one on the left from 42, one on the right from 46, in which the Rosie the Riveters are being told, go back home and have yourself some kids. We talked about this happening too in the post-World War I period, if you remember back to our conversations about the bob haircut. So very similar kind of period in which there's a sort of anxiety about like, oh, what are all these women who used to be working? What are they going to do now that the war's over? Gosh, I hope they go back home and have a bunch of kids. And you can see the press is very explicitly trying to encourage them to do that. So the New Look is happening at this moment in which women are being sort of encouraged to go back into their pre-war roles. And what's important to understand, to contextualize the New Look, is how different it was from the kinds of clothes that women were wearing during the war. So on the left, I'm showing you some women in suits in London in 1941 during the war. So you can see short skirts, about knee length. That's due to fabric rationing as well as taste and styles. Simpler styles of jackets. You've got some tweeds. Also notice many of these women are wearing flat shoes. These are probably women who are working different kinds of jobs during the war, and probably these are the suits they're wearing to those jobs. Then you look at the New Look. We have a longer skirt. much longer, in fact, a wider skirt, not so narrow, not the sort of pencil skirt style you see these British women wearing. And then you have this very heavily nipped in waist. So if you notice the difference between the silhouette, the body shape of the model in the New Look coat versus the silhouettes of the women in the World War II styles, you can see it's totally different. Much more emphasis in the New Look on the bust as well. And then you also have this straw hat topping everything off. So longer length, nipped in waist. Also, a lot more fabric is involved in making a New Look dress. So the skirt stretched to 42 inches wide. These dresses used up a whole lot of fabric. And it's interesting to note that a fabric manufacturer was the backer of Christian Dior's first show. So maybe some mixed interests there. But these were garments that used a lot of fabric, that were very fabric intensive. And the waists, by the way, would have been nipped in by many different undergarments. Here you can see some of them. In this case, we've just got a bra and a petticoat that's giving fullness to the skirt. But many women who were wearing the New Look were also wearing corseting, which women had not been wearing for quite some time. They'd been wearing girdles, sure, definitely, no doubt, but hadn't been wearing corsets like since their grandmas, right? At this point. So the corsets were fairly extreme. Waists were made up to 2 inches smaller through corsetry. So that's pretty nipped in. You can see this image of Dior on the cover of Paris Match. And it's showing the shift of the skirt hemline. And he declared that skirts should be 13 inches above the ground to 4 inches above the ground. They shouldn't be any higher than that. And you can see in some of these other images of dresses from in the center, the 47 collection, and then a slightly later collection on the right, they're very molded in their form. They're quite architectural in a sense, and very different from the somewhat more free-moving looks of the war years. Certainly for a woman who'd spent her war years in overalls, but even, as you can see, one of Muriel King's skirt ensembles, this little kind of shirt dress on the left-hand side, these are much more structured garments that Dior is designing. So these garments were really celebrated in the American press. They were, touted, just that name, the New Look, this idea that they were modern and exciting, and that, of course, every woman would want these. They were really heavily marketed by the American press. And this was in part in the American press's effort to help to revive the French fashion industry after the war. I mean, this had a lot to do with diplomatic things that were going on, and the Marshall Plan, and the politics of the post-war period. But let me tell you, women were not having it. There were many women who protested against the New Look, and these were not just like a little thing here and a little thing there. These were serious protests. They were long and intense, and they were happening in America, they were happening in Britain, they were happening in France. So here you see some images of those protests, and I think they give you a sense of what women didn't like. Women called themselves, in America anyway, they formed clubs called the Little Below the Knee Club, suggesting that that's where they wanted their skirts to hang. So on the top left, you can see women in Chicago protesting, and you can see the language of freedom is being used in these posters. Women, join the fight for freedom. So if you imagine yourself as a woman who's maybe taken on some war work in the war years and been, told you were fighting for freedom, and then the war ends and Vogue and Harper's Bazaar are telling you in order to embrace the new style, you need to start buying more French fashion, really expensive French fashion that is in a totally different shape and style than you've been wearing during the war and looks a heck of a lot less comfortable and a little bit more like what your grandma wore. then you're not going to really want to go back to that. That doesn't feel like freedom. So it's a really interesting moment where you have women sort of asserting this idea of freedom of dress. And a lot of the framing also was of speaking about France as being fascist in its kind of fashion dictatorship. There was a sense among, I think, especially British and American women, that they didn't want to follow the whims of French fashion anymore, that wasn't really important to them anymore. And that this idea that women everywhere should be dressing the way that French women do, and more to point, the way that French designers think women should, was really anathema to many women. Also important was these protests were happening at the same time as there were protests of rising costs of food, and rationing was still happening in France and in the UK when these new look dresses came out, and they definitely did not fit with rationing guidelines. The image on the bottom right is of a famous series of images of this story of a model being physically attacked. You can see in her new look dress being ripped off by people who were, I think, standing in a bread line in Paris. It's not clear if this was really what happened or this was a publicity stunt, but I think it gives you a sense of the real anger that was part of some of these protests of the new look. In Baltimore, we had a Little Below the Knee Club, by the way. I really like the image on the bottom left. And you can see women, a woman on the left dressing in an old style bathing suit saying, "Will this be next?" Also a woman in the center making fun of the name of Lucien Lelong, who was a French designer, the Lucien Too Long barrel silhouette. And then another woman saying, "We won't revert to grandma's skirt." So this sense from women was really, we're not going to go back. We're not going backwards. We have embraced these new styles and we want to continue embracing them. There were also some protests from men, and you can see one here on the top right, men protesting against longer hemlines, wanting to continue to be able to see women's legs. So, you know, there's many sides to this, but I think it's a really interesting chapter, and it suggests that fashion history is much more complicated, as we well know, than designers just deciding, oh, this is what you're going to wear next season. And I think the new look, because it really felt to many women like it was the kind of tyranny of a designer just on a whim saying, oh, skirts should be longer, waist should be narrower. These women were saying, no, we're not going to change our bodies and change our comfort to suit your style. And so what we really end up seeing at mid-century, especially in America, is a shift to more casual styles. And this really is the push that Deirdre Clemente in her book Dress Casual is arguing kind of comes from college campuses. And I think if you think about young women particularly, but also young men on college campuses wearing more casual clothes, maybe not wanting to leave those casual clothes once they graduate. So here you can see some examples of some of Clare McCardell's play clothes, as she called them, some rompers and sunsuits. Like all of these could have walked out the door yesterday and looked entirely chic and entirely smart, as McCardell would say. You have a legging ensemble with, again, some little Capezio booties and a great little jacket with that striped pattern. You can see her love of patterns in all of these. And trousers really continue to be around for women in the post-war period, although always kind of as a negotiation. So this is an example that I saw at the MFA in Boston at their recent show on gender bending fashion. On the left-hand side, this is an ensemble for Evanpicone by Kay Thompson. Thompson was a nightclub singer. She was an actress. She appeared in the film Funny Face. You might know her as the author of Eloise at the Plaza. But as it happens, she also designed trousers in the early 1950s, and they were inspired by the ones that she wore, as you can see here in her nightclub act. She was known for wearing trousers. So much so that there was actually an article in 1952 with the headline, Kay Fancy Pants Thompson photographed in a skirt at last, end quote. And there's all kinds of articles about her wearing pants and how, oh my gosh, she's wearing pants. So like I said, there's a lot of ink spills in this period about women wearing pants. But she designed them for Evanpicone. Marlene Dietrich wore this ensemble, which is pretty fabulous. And I have to say, when I look at it, I think it's got to be inspired by the Zoot Suit. And I'm thinking maybe Thompson was looking at somebody like Cab Calloway, you know, as herself a jazz singer. It makes sense to me that that would have been sort of one of her style icons for these kinds of trousers. But what's really interesting to me is that when they're first marketed, Evanpicone doesn't put their name on the ads at all. They're marketed as Kay Thompson's, you know, taper pants trousers, right? But they become popular enough by the middle of the 1950s that they've taken Kay Thompson's name off totally, and now they're marketed as Diva, tailored by Evanpicone. So I think it's a really interesting story where Evanpicone was like so nervous about selling trousers for women that they're like, let's not put our name on them. Let's put somebody else's name on them. And then once they take off among women, they're happy to put their name on them and, you know, leave poor Kay Thompson out of the picture. But trousers for women and more casual styles of dress really become popular in the 1950s. You can see some Levi's looks there on the left. For, you know, casual activities, you know, people are still dressing for dinner, dressing for particular occasions, but there's a sense of leisure time and leisure wear, sportswear that's really growing and developing in the 1950s. And also it begins to be represented on television. So while you have, you know, June Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver always wearing a dress, you have somebody like Lucille Ball and Ethel Mertz on I Love Lucy beginning to be seen in pants on these television shows. And that's hugely influential because unlike our television landscape today, which is, you know, so split up and everybody's watching something different. We've got 10 million different options. There were like, you know, 3 channels in the 1950s. So almost everybody's watching Lucy. So if Lucy's wearing pants on television, like that's a thing. That's a real thing. Lucy also loved these kind of hostess ensembles, which I just adore, which include these sort of overskirts over trousers. And you can see in Vogue this great pair over these sort of capri length pants. So there were these sort of mitigations of trousers in the 1950s using this overskirt. Reminds me of the kind of overskirt over the bloomers, right? So like we see this recurring theme. By the time we get to the 1960s, the great Mary Tyler Moore actually insisted on wearing pants in her television show. The sponsors famously told her that they would only permit one scene in each episode so long as the pants didn't, quote, cup under her rear end. But the show ended up pushing this a lot further, and she wore them much more often than just once a show, and they were a sensation. So by the 1960s, trousers become a much more prevalent part of American women's wardrobes. So there's a little capsule collection of mid-century style, and keep this in your minds as we're talking in our coming weeks about queer style. I think this will give you a sense of kind of the fashion landscape leading up to there. See you soon. Bye.